Ever notice how history loves to throw us these curveballs?
Mm.
Like those alliances you never would have seen coming, the ones that make you rethink everything you thought you knew?
Mm.
Well, buckle up, because today we are diving deep into British India, going beyond the usual narrative
Okay.
to explore the relationship between the British Raj and the Brahmin caste.
Fascinating stuff.
It's a dynamic that's often overlooked, but trust me, it gets pretty wild.
It really does. You see, it's easy to think of British rule as this very black and white, us versus them situation.
Right, totally.
But the reality, as with most things in history, is far more nuanced.
Right.
Over that century of colonial rule, things got complicated,
Of course.
Different groups within India interacted with the British in different ways, and some of those relationships had lasting consequences. Really make you think.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. When we talk about Brahmins in this context, who are we talking about? I know they have a place in Hinduism, right?
Absolutely. Think of Indian society at the time as a very rigid hierarchy.
Okay.
A bit like a pyramid, with the Brahmins right there at the top. For centuries, they held immense social and religious influence, revered as priests, scholars, the keepers of traditional knowledge.
Like the gatekeepers in a way.
Exactly. They were essential to how Indian society functioned, really.
So picture this. The British show up, thousands of miles from home, ready to rule this vast, intricate land they don't fully understand.
Quite a challenge.
I can only imagine they needed like a crash course in Indian society.
They definitely needed help cracking the code, so to speak.
Exactly. And that's where this fascinating dynamic of give and take comes into play, right?
Precisely.
The British needed local expertise to govern effectively.
Of course.
And the Brahmins, well, they saw an opportunity
Right.
to maintain their influence, even under a whole new power structure.
It was a win-win, or at least they hoped it would be.
A classic case of it's complicated, right?
Absolutely.
We're not talking about good guys and bad guys here, but understanding the motivations
Sure.
and the strategies at play on both sides.
For sure.
So how did this quid pro quo actually play out on the ground? Give me an example.
Well, let's look at how the British went about understanding Indian society in the first place.
Okay.
Through ethnography and anthropology.
Right.
They relied heavily on Brahmin scholars to interpret cultural practices, to categorize different groups, to basically explain the social fabric of India.
So they went straight to the top, to the very group who already held the most social capital.
Exactly.
What could possibly go wrong?
Well, that's where things get interesting.
I bet.
This reliance on Brahmin knowledge essentially allowed them to shape British understanding of India
Okay.
in ways that often reinforce their own position.
It's like asking the people who benefit most from a system to explain how fair and balanced it is.
Right, B.
You got it. I'm starting to see where this is going.
Take the work of H.H. Risley, for example.
Okay.
A British administrator who used anthropometric data, things like measuring the size and shape of people's noses to categorize different groups in India.
Hold on. They were out there measuring noses.
It sounds strange now, I know.
Just a tad.
But this was considered cutting-edge science at the time. And guess whose noses were deemed the most ideal according to these measurements?
I have a feeling I know the answer. The Brahmins.
Right on the money. Risley's work, though presented as scientific, ended up reinforcing pre-existing social hierarchies.
Of course.
And while we can't say for sure if it was intentional, it certainly benefited those already at the top.
A self-fulfilling prophecy, in a way.
Exactly.
But this can't just be about noses, right? This dynamic must have popped up in other areas of British policy.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just about academic studies. This Brahmin influence wormed its way into how the British governed.
Yeah.
And it all circles back to that idea of quid pro quo. Let's look at the introduction of reservations in government jobs, for example.
Okay, because from what I understand, the reservation system was originally intended to address inequalities, right? Created by the caste system to level the playing field a bit.
You would think so, but the story takes a fascinating turn.
Ooh.
The initial push for representation in British administration actually came from Brahmins, who, thanks to their existing educational traditions and access to resources, were in a prime position to benefit.
Wait, so the group that was supposed to be lifted up ended up being the ones who benefited most?
It's true. And it created resentment among other caste groups.
I can imagine.
This eventually led to the implementation of quotas, but even then, Brahmins managed to secure a disproportionately high quota compared to their actual population percentage.
Wow, that's quite a maneuver. It seems like they had a knack for coming out on top even when it looked like the rules were changing. What about land ownership? That always seems to be at the heart of power. Did this dynamic touch on that at all?
Absolutely. This is where things get really interesting. Instead of dismantling the existing systems of land ownership, the British often continued, and in some cases even expanded, tax-free land grants called inams,
Oh.
many of which were held by Brahmins, especially for religious purposes.
So they're essentially getting a free pass while others are carrying the weight.
In a nutshell, yes. Imagine you're a farmer who has to pay taxes on your land, while your neighbor, a Brahmin, gets to keep their land tax-free because of a system that's been in place for centuries.
Yeah, not exactly a recipe for social harmony.
You got that right. And I'm guessing the British saw this as a small price to pay for keeping the peace and maintaining stability.
Precisely. They also continued the Marasadar system in South India, where Brahmins held vast tracts of land and were exempt from certain taxes. Essentially, the British found it easier to work within the existing power structures than to try and dismantle them,
It was all about pragmatism, for better or for worse.
even if it meant perpetuating certain inequalities.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how these seemingly small compromises can have such significant ripple effects.
Yeah.
We're talking about policies that impacted people's lives for generations.
And it wasn't just limited to land and administration. This intricate dance between the British and the Brahmins seeped into other areas of life as well,
Really?
like education, the military, even the legal system.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how this dynamic played out in those areas, because that's where things start to feel really tangible.
Absolutely. Let's start with education. When the British introduced English education in India, they saw it as a way to create a class of Indians who could help them govern.
Makes sense.
But who do you think had the most to gain from this new system?
I think I'm starting to catch on here. The Brahmins. With their tradition of scholarship and access to resources, they were already primed to excel in this new system.
Exactly. They were the first in line to benefit, securing coveted positions in administration, law, and other fields. This gave them a significant advantage in navigating the colonial system, and its effects can be felt in subtle ways even today.
Wow, talk about a leg up. It's like you got a head start in the race to succeed in this new world. But what about the military? I'm curious about how that played out.
The military is a fascinating example. Before the 1857 mutiny, which is a real turning point,
Right, of course.
the British Army heavily favored Brahmin recruits.
Really? What made them so appealing to the British military minds at the time?
They believed Brahmins were inherently more disciplined, more refined than other groups,
Interesting.
possessing qualities they deemed ideal for soldiers.
So the same biases they applied to governance, they also applied to the military. They saw in Brahmins what they wanted to see.
Yes, and it's worth noting that this perception wasn't based on any real evidence.
Right.
More on preconceived notions about caste and behavior.
Of course.
Of course, this all changed dramatically after the 1857 mutiny, when some Brahmin regiments were at the forefront of the uprising.
Right, because an event like that would certainly make them rethink their recruitment strategy.
Yeah.
Suddenly, those ideal qualities weren't looking so ideal anymore.
Precisely. The 1857 mutiny really exposed the cracks in this alliance. It showed that even within these seemingly cozy relationships, mistrust and conflicting interests were always simmering beneath the surface. It's a stark reminder that history is rarely about black and white alliances.
So they went from being the ideal recruits to almost a liability overnight.
In a way, yes. Many British officials began to see Brahmin influence within the army as a potential threat,
Okay.
a breeding ground for dissent. This led to significant shifts in recruitment policies, with the British now favoring other groups they perceived as more loyal or easier to control.
Wow, talk about a 180. Okay, you mentioned that this dynamic even touched the legal system. That's something I have to hear more about. How did that play out?
This is where it gets really interesting. Believe it or not, up until the early 19th century, Brahmins accused of certain crimes, even murder, within the holy city of Varanasi,
Wow.
were exempt from the death penalty under British law.
Wait, seriously? So even under a whole new legal system, they still enjoyed special privileges. How is that possible?
It highlights how deeply the British were willing to embed themselves within the existing social structures.
Right.
They didn't arrive in India with the intention of completely overhauling the legal system. They wanted to rule effectively, and to do that, they needed the cooperation of powerful local elites.
So in a way, they were operating within two different legal realities, one for the rulers and one for the ruled.
You could say that it underscores how entrenched these power dynamics were. Even when the British established their own courts, the influence of caste, particularly Brahminical influence, continued to hold sway.
It's mind-boggling how this dynamic permeated so many aspects of life. From education to the army, even the courts, it's like this unspoken agreement underpinned everything. It makes you wonder about the individuals who lived through this time. Did any prominent figures weigh in on this dynamic?
Well, you can't talk about the British Raj without mentioning Winston Churchill.
Of course not.
Now, Churchill was a complex figure,
That's putting it mildly.
and his views on India were often, shall we say, complicated and controversial.
That's one way to put it.
hmm
What did he have to say about this Brahmin British dynamic?
He definitely had some opinions. It's important to remember that these were Churchill's personal views,
Of course.
shaped by his own experiences and biases, not necessarily objective truths.
Right. Just one perspective among many.
That said, he did express concerns about Brahmin domination, potentially replacing British rule. He saw them as a privileged class with what he called overwhelming official and social power.
Wow, he didn't mince words. But it's interesting because in a way, he was acknowledging the very system he represented, the British Raj, could easily be replaced by another elite group.
Precisely. He even criticized the tax exemptions and the dominance of Brahmins in the civil service, arguing that the reforms at the time would only solidify their power. Churchill, for all his flaws, understood power dynamics, and he saw this relationship as a potential threat to British interests.
It's almost ironic. He saw the potential for the British Empire to be undone, not by force, but by simply being replaced from within.
Exactly, and that's what makes history so fascinating. It's full of these unintended consequences and unforeseen ripple effects. Churchill's views, however problematic, offer a glimpse into how some within the British establishment perceived this complex relationship, even if they didn't always fully grasp the nuances.
It seems like every layer we peel back reveals another layer of complexity. It's a good reminder that history is never as simple as it seems in the textbooks.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that just because a particular group might have benefited from a system
Right.
doesn't mean everyone within that group agreed with it or benefited equally.
Of course, of course.
To paint any historical group with a single brushstroke is to miss the nuances, the individual stories, and the dissenting voices that make history so compelling.
It's about remembering that history is made up of individuals, each with their own motivations and actions. To simplify it is to miss the point entirely.
I couldn't agree more. It's about seeing the shades of gray, not just black and white. To acknowledge the advantages certain groups may have had, while also celebrating those who transcended those limitations and fought for a more just and equitable society.
So, fast forward to today. How does this complex relationship from the past, this intricate dance between the British and the Brahmins, how does it continue to shape India today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The legacy of this period is woven into the fabric of modern India,
Right.
sometimes in subtle, often invisible ways. For instance, the advantages that Brahmins gained in areas like education and administration did contribute to their continued representation in various fields, even though the caste system itself is officially abolished.
So those early advantages, those ripples from the past, they still have some impact today.
In some ways, yes, of course. India has made incredible strides in social mobility and representation since independence. It's a vibrant democracy with a diverse and dynamic population. However, to fully understand some of the social dynamics at play, certain inequalities that linger, you have to grapple with these historical roots.
It's like those echoes of the past.
Yeah.
Those subtle whispers that remind us how interconnected everything is. We tend to think of history as this distant thing, but it's very much alive in the present.
Exactly. And it's not about assigning blame or perpetuating divisions, but rather understanding the complexities we've inherited and working towards a more equitable future.
Which brings us to the big question. The one we want you pondering long after this deep dive is over. What if things had played out differently? What if the British hadn't found such willing allies in the Brahmins? How might India's history, its very identity, have been different?
Now that is something to think about. History, after all, is a series of choices, of alliances formed and broken. It's up to us to learn from those choices, to understand their ripple effects, and to create a future where those echoes of the past no longer define us.
It makes you wonder what other overlooked corners of history might hold similar surprises, similar complexities waiting to be unraveled.
It's a reminder that the stories we tell about the past, the narratives we create, they have a profound impact on how we understand the present and shape the future.
Well said. It's been quite a journey exploring this complex relationship between the British Raj and the Brahmin caste. A real eye-opener, to say the least. And for you listening, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring those overlooked corners of history. You never know what you might find.